In the autumn of 1976, in a wood-panelled boardroom at New Court in the City of London, a 45-year-old banker sat across the table from his French cousins and did something that no Rothschild had been able to do for nearly 30 years. He got them to agree. The Rothschild name is the most famous name in the history of banking. For 2 centuries, it has been synonymous with wealth so vast that it generated its own mythology. Stories of carrier pigeons delivering news of Waterloo, of loans to governments fighting wars, of a family that controlled the financial destinies of nations. The name appears in conspiracy theories, in novels, in the language of anti-Semitism, in the hagiography of capitalism. It is, in the fullest sense, legendary. But legends do not automatically survive the passage of time, the fracturing of families, the disruption of wars, and the restructuring of the financial world. By the early 1970s, the Rothschild family banking empire was not the unified force of its 19th century prime. It was a collection of distinct national institutions, N M Rothschild in London, de Rothschild Frères in Paris, and various other branches and affiliates that bore the same name, shared a common ancestry, and cooperated when convenient, but operated with the independence and occasional rivalry of institutions that had been separated by politics, war, and the passage of generations. The French branch and the English branch had not shared a single unified banking operation since the Second World War had made such cooperation impossible. The wounds of that separation, the different choices made, the different paths taken, the different pressures endured, had not fully healed in the decades since. The 2 houses were family. They were not, in any operational sense, a single institution. Evelyn de Rothschild changed that. Over the course of the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, he worked to reunite the fractured Rothschild banking operations into something that could function coherently in the modern financial world. A world that had changed so dramatically since the Rothschilds' 19th century prime that simple maintenance of what existed was not enough. The family empire needed to be rebuilt for a new era. He was not the most naturally gifted banker the Rothschild family had produced. He was not the most intellectually brilliant. He was not the most innovative financial mind of his generation. What he was, and what the specific circumstances of 1976 required, was something rarer and more difficult. A man capable of holding together a family of extraordinary individuals who had every reason, given their history and their temperament, to go in different directions. This is the story of how Evelyn de Rothschild inherited a fractured dynasty and spent 30 years putting it back together. And it begins not in the boardroom at New Court, but in the specific circumstances of a family that had survived 2,000 years of persecution, 5 generations of banking dominance, and 1 catastrophic world war, and that was, by the 1970s, in danger of losing in peacetime what it had preserved through the most violent century in human history. Evelyn Robert Adrian de Rothschild was born on August 29, 1931, at his family's London townhouse. He was the son of Anthony Gustave de Rothschild, a partner in N M Rothschild, and Yvonne Cairn d'Anvers, whose family was connected to the French branch of the Rothschild banking dynasty. His birth connected him, by blood and by expectation, to the full weight of Rothschild family history on both the English and French sides. His childhood was shaped by the specific circumstances of the English upper class in the 1930s, the private schools, the country houses, the combination of enormous privilege and genuine formality that characterized the world of the English financial establishment. He attended Harrow, the same school that Winston Churchill had attended several decades earlier, and subsequently went to Trinity College, Cambridge, where he read economics with the moderate distinction of a man who was intelligent but not academically driven. Cambridge in the early 1950s was an extraordinary environment, a place where the intellectual currents of the post-war world were being worked through by a generation that had grown up during the war and was attempting to understand what the world was going to become in its aftermath. Evelyn was not at the center of that intellectual ferment. He was, by his own later account, a sociable and engaged student, more interested in the relationships and the experiences of university life than in the academic substance. He made friends, some of whom would remain important to him professionally and personally for decades. He developed the social ease and the network of personal connections that would prove to be among his most important professional assets. After Cambridge, he joined N M Rothschild as a junior employee. the expected path for a member of the family who was going to be involved in the banking business, beginning at the bottom of the professional hierarchy, rather than being installed in a position of authority that his name would have technically justified. This was the Rothschild tradition. Family members who were going to be partners in the firm needed to demonstrate competence and judgment, not merely lineage, before being trusted with responsibility. The N M Rothschild of the early 1950s was a distinguished but somewhat diminished institution by the standards of its 19th century predecessor. The decolonization of the British Empire was underway, reducing the significance of the commodity financing and government lending that had been central to the Rothschild business in the previous century. The City of London itself was operating in a tightly regulated post-war environment, in which the scope for the kind of bold, innovative financial activity that had characterized the Rothschilds at their peak was significantly constrained. The bank was profitable and respected, but it was not the dominant force in global finance that it had once been. Evelyn spent the late 1950s and the 1960s learning the business, moving through different departments, developing relationships with clients and counterparties, building the specific knowledge of how the bank operated that would eventually be necessary if he was going to play a leadership role in it. He was, during this period, a capable but not yet transformative figure, one of several young Rothschild family members who might, in different circumstances, have been the one to lead the institution forward. The death of his cousin Leo de Rothschild in 1973 changed the succession picture significantly. Leo had been widely expected to become the senior partner of N M Rothschild, and his early death at the age of 40 removed the man who had seemed most naturally positioned for the role. Evelyn, 3 years Leo's senior, and by then a seasoned partner of the firm, became the most prominent candidate to take the leadership role that Leo's death had left open. He was formally made chairman of N M Rothschild in 1976. He was 44 years old, and he inherited a set of challenges that went well beyond the management of the bank itself. The most immediate of these challenges was the relationship with the French branch. The Paris house, now called Rothschild Frères, was managed by Baron Guy de Rothschild, a figure of formidable personality and enormous personal authority within the French business establishment. Guy was 20 years older than Evelyn, had survived the Nazi occupation with a combination of personal courage and strategic retreat, and had rebuilt the Paris house into a significant institution in French finance. He was not the kind of man who was naturally inclined to defer to a younger English cousin on questions about the future of the family banking operations. The relationship between Evelyn and Guy was not antagonistic. They were family, they shared common interests, and they both understood that the separation between the London and Paris houses was not in the long-term interest of either. But it was complicated by the generational difference, by the different national perspectives that 50 years of operating in different countries had produced, and by the specific trauma of the Paris house's wartime experience, which had given Guy and his generation of French Rothschilds a relationship to the family history that their English counterparts, who had not experienced occupation, could not fully share. Evelyn's task, as he assumed the chairmanship of N M Rothschild in 1976, was to navigate this complexity, to rebuild the coordination between the London and Paris houses without imposing a structure that the fiercely independent French branch would reject. And to do this, while simultaneously managing the London bank's adaptation to a financial world that was changing faster than at any point since the 19th century. The Rothschild family, by the time Evelyn took the chairmanship in 1976, had been the subject of more written history, more public mythology, and more deliberate misrepresentation than almost any family in the Western world. Understanding what Evelyn actually inherited requires cutting through the mythology to the specific institutional reality of the mid-1970s Rothschild banking operations. N M Rothschild Sons in London was, in 1976, a private partnership, not a limited company with shareholders, not a public bank with regulatory capital requirements of the modern kind, but a private firm in which the partners were the owners and the profits accrued to those partners directly. This structure, which had been the foundation of the Rothschild banking business since its earliest days, had significant advantages and significant disadvantages in the financial world of the 1970s. The advantages were those of private ownership generally, a long-time horizon, unencumbered by quarterly earnings pressures, the ability to make decisions quickly without the governance processes that public companies require, the alignment of management and ownership interests that is the fundamental virtue of private enterprise. and the confidentiality about financial affairs that private status enables. The Rothschilds did not have to disclose their financial results to the public, which meant that competitors, counterparties, and the press could not assess the bank's condition from official sources, an advantage in a business where information is currency. The disadvantages were equally significant. The private partnership structure limited the capital that the bank could raise to what the partners could provide from their own resources, supplemented by the bank's retained earnings. In an era of financial globalization and increasing transaction scales, this capital constraint was becoming more significant. The great commercial and investment banks that were transforming the global financial system in the 1970s, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, the emerging Japanese banks, had access to capital at a scale that no private partnership could match. N M Rothschild's competitive position, therefore, depended not on scale but on something else, on the reputation, the relationships, the specific expertise, and the particular judgment that the Rothschild name represented. This was a viable competitive strategy in certain segments of the market. Advisory work for major transactions, where the Rothschild relationships and reputation commanded fees that were not directly related to the capital deployed. Gold trading, where the bank's role in fixing the London gold price gave it a structural position in one of the most important commodity markets in the world. And the financing of certain transactions that required the specific trust and discretion that the Rothschild brand had accumulated over 2 centuries. But it was not a viable strategy across the full range of financial services that the emerging global investment banks were developing. The leveraged buyouts, the massive bond issuances, the complex derivatives that were beginning to define the frontier of investment banking in the 1970s and 1980s required capital at a scale that private partnerships could not provide. Evelyn understood this, and it shaped his strategic thinking about what N M Rothschild needed to become. The Paris house presented a different set of circumstances. Rothschild Frères in Paris, managed by Guy de Rothschild throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s, had positioned itself as a significant participant in French corporate finance, advising on major French transactions, maintaining relationships with the leading figures of French industry and government, and building an investment banking capability that was genuinely competitive in the French domestic market. The Paris house had also made a set of investments in French industry, in media, in real estate. That reflected Guy de Rothschild's instinct for using the banking business as a platform for building a broader business empire rather than maintaining the pure banking focus that the London house had generally maintained. These investments created a different character for the Paris institution. It was simultaneously a bank and a holding company for a range of industrial and commercial assets. The relationship between the two houses was governed by informal understanding rather than by formal legal agreement. They cooperated on transactions where cooperation made sense. They shared the Rothschild name and the brand equity that the name represented. But they were operationally independent, making their own hiring decisions, their own client decisions, their own strategic decisions, in ways that created the possibility of divergence and the actuality of occasional friction. The most sensitive dimension of the relationship was the question of the Rothschild name itself. In a world of increasingly branded financial services, the Rothschild name was an asset of enormous value, a brand with global recognition, specific associations with reliability, discretion, and extraordinary institutional history, and a prestige that opened doors in ways that a less historically significant name could not. Managing this brand asset, ensuring that both houses maintained the standards that the name represented, that neither made decisions that would damage the brand across the entire family, that the shared name worked as an asset rather than as a liability, required coordination that the informal relationship between the houses was not well designed to provide. This was the institutional reality that Evelyn de Rothschild inherited in 1976. Not a unified empire, not a declining institution beyond saving, but a fractured family business with genuine assets. The name, the relationships, the specific expertise, and a set of structural problems that had been developing for 30 years and that required deliberate, sustained effort to address. The question was not whether Evelyn had the financial brilliance of Nathan Rothschild or the organizational genius of Mayer Amschel. The question was whether he had the specific qualities that 1976 required. The patience to work across family relationships that were complex and occasionally resistant. The strategic clarity to identify what mattered and what didn't. and the personal authority to make and sustain decisions in the face of the inevitable resistance that change generates in any established institution. The evidence of the following 3 decades is that he did. The most dramatic external event of Evelyn de Rothschild's tenure as chairman of N M Rothschild was not anything he caused or could control. It was the nationalization of the Paris house by the French socialist government in 1981, an event that destroyed the French Rothschild banking operation that had existed for a century and a half, and that forced a fundamental rethinking of how the family would maintain its presence in French finance. François Mitterrand was elected president of France in May 1981 on a platform that included the nationalization of the major French banks and insurance companies. The commitment was ideological, a fulfillment of the Socialist Party's long-standing position that the major financial institutions of France should be under public control. But it was also personal, in the sense that the Rothschild family name had long served in French left-wing politics as a symbol of the concentrated private financial power that the left opposed. The nationalization decree came in February 1982. Rothschild Frères was included in the list of institutions to be nationalized. The French government acquired the bank and its assets at a price that the Rothschild family regarded as significantly below fair value, a dispute that generated legal proceedings, but that could not ultimately prevent the fundamental fact of the nationalization. For Guy de Rothschild, the nationalization was a personal catastrophe of a kind that his generation had already experienced once before. He had been forced to abandon his family's assets during the Nazi occupation of France in the early 1940s. The Chateau Lafite wine estate, the Paris house, the accumulated property of generations, had been confiscated by German authorities who considered Jewish property forfeit to the Reich. He had rebuilt after the war, reconstructing the Paris banking operation from the wreckage of the occupation with the energy of a man determined to demonstrate that what had been taken could be restored. Now, 40 years later, a democratically elected French government was doing something that felt, to Guy, uncomfortably similar. He expressed this in terms that made international news and that captured something genuine about the psychological experience of a family that had survived persecution across many centuries. He described the experience of a Jew having his property confiscated by a socialist government as having been robbed twice by France in a single lifetime. The statement was controversial. The nationalization was a democratically mandated policy action, not an act of persecution in any meaningful comparison to what the Nazis had done, and conflating the two offended many people who were sympathetic to the Rothschilds' financial grievance, while rejecting the political framing. But it expressed something real about how Guy and his generation of French Rothschilds experienced the event, and it revealed the depth of the family's identification with what they had built in France. The nationalization forced a complete restructuring of the French Rothschild presence. The old Rothschild Frères bank ceased to exist as a Rothschild institution. A new entity, Rothschild and CIA Bank, was established by David de Rothschild, Guy's son, with a significantly reduced capital base that was available after the nationalization settlement. David was 39 years old when he began rebuilding the French operation, and he did so with an energy and intelligence that eventually produced a new Paris house that was, in some respects, better adapted to the financial world of the late 20th century than the old Rothschild Frères had been. From Evelyn's perspective in London, the French nationalization was both a crisis and an opportunity. The crisis was obvious. The loss of the Paris banking operation removed the most significant other pole of the Rothschild banking world and made the coordination between London and Paris that Evelyn had been working towards suddenly much more complicated. The partner he had been trying to bring into closer alignment with London had effectively been dispossessed of its institutional base. The opportunity was less obvious, but real. The nationalization, by forcing a complete rebuild of the French operation, created the possibility of restructuring the relationship between London and Paris on a new basis, one that was explicitly designed for the financial world of the 1980s, rather than one that had evolved organically from the specific circumstances of the post-war decades. The rebuilt French house could be structured in a way that was more compatible with the London operation than the old Rothschild Frères had been. This would take time. Rebuilding takes longer than destroying, and David de Rothschild was focused in the immediate aftermath of the nationalization on establishing the new Paris entity on solid footing rather than on the broader question of how it related to London. But the longer-term trajectory over the following decade, moved in the direction of closer coordination between the London and Paris houses, a coordination that would eventually, under Evelyn's sustained effort and David's willing participation, produce the unified Rothschild & Co. of the 21st century. The nationalization also had a more immediate practical consequence for N M Rothschild in London. Some of the clients and relationships of the Paris house, whose French banking operations had been disrupted by the nationalization, turned more actively to London for their banking needs. The geographic and institutional disruption of the French operation, while damaging to the family's overall banking position, created specific opportunities for the London house that helped sustain its business through the early 1980s. Evelyn's response to the nationalization demonstrated qualities that would characterize his leadership throughout his tenure: the ability to acknowledge a setback without allowing it to define the strategic direction, the patience to work through the consequences over the long term rather than reacting with decisions driven by the emotional intensity of the immediate crisis, and the maintenance of the family relationships, particularly with Guy and subsequently with David, that were the foundation of any eventual reunification. While the French nationalization was the most dramatic external event of Evelyn's early tenure, the more consequential transformation of the environment in which he operated was the deregulation of the British financial system, the event known as the Big Bang, which occurred on October 27, 1986, and which restructured the City of London from a gentlemanly, relationship-based, relatively closed financial community into an integrated, competitive, globally connected financial center of the first order. The Big Bang was the result of a settlement between the London Stock Exchange and the British government, which had been threatening antitrust action against the exchange's restrictive practices. The settlement eliminated fixed commissions on securities transactions, abolished the separation between stockbrokers and jobbers that had been the structural foundation of the London market for decades, and allowed foreign firms to own British brokerage and market-making operations. The consequences were rapid and transformative. The major American and Japanese investment banks, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Nomura, Daiwa, moved aggressively into London, acquiring existing British firms or establishing new operations, bringing with them the capital, the technology, and the aggressive competitive culture of markets that had already been through deregulation. The gentlemanly culture of the old city, where relationships mattered more than price, where the old-school network was the most important professional qualification, where firms competed on service and reputation rather than on the raw computational power of their trading operations, was disrupted with a speed that left many established city institutions struggling to adapt. For N M Rothschild, the Big Bang was both threatening and, in certain respects, clarifying. The threat was obvious. The old competitive advantages of relationship and reputation were being supplemented, and in some areas supplanted, by the capital and the trading technology that the large integrated investment banks brought. In the trading and market-making businesses that the Big Bang restructured, a private partnership with limited capital could not compete with the Goldman Sachses and Morgan Stanleys that were moving into London with essentially unlimited capital at their disposal. The clarification was equally valuable. The Big Bang made explicit what the changing financial environment had been suggesting for some time, that N M Rothschild could not compete across the full range of financial services that the major integrated investment banks were offering. The attempt to do so would require capital the bank did not have and could not easily raise without fundamentally changing its ownership structure. The strategic choice that the Big Bang forced was a choice about what kind of bank N M Rothschild was going to be. Evelyn's answer to this question shaped the bank's strategy for the following 2 decades. N M Rothschild would not attempt to compete with the large investment banks across the full range of their activities. It would instead concentrate on the areas where its specific advantages, the name, the relationships, the reputation for discretion and judgment, the specific expertise in areas like gold trading and advisory work, gave it a competitive position that the large banks could not easily replicate. The advisory business was the most promising of these areas. As the wave of mergers, acquisitions and corporate restructurings that characterized the 1980s financial environment gathered pace, the demand for independent, high-quality financial advice on major transactions grew significantly. Companies undertaking transformative deals wanted advisors whose judgment they trusted, whose interests were aligned with theirs, and whose relationships extended across the range of people who would be involved in completing the transaction. N M Rothschild's reputation, its relationships with major companies and governments across Europe, and its specific expertise in valuation and structuring made it a credible and often preferred advisor on major European transactions. The gold business was another area of maintained competitive strength. The twice-daily London Gold Fix, the benchmark pricing mechanism for the global gold market, in which N M Rothschild participated as one of the 5 member banks, gave the bank a structural position in the gold market that was not available to its competitors. The Gold Fix had been established in 1919, when the gold market was reconstituted after the disruptions of the First World War, and N M Rothschild had been a member since the beginning. The knowledge, the relationships, and the operational capabilities that the gold business had generated over decades were genuine competitive advantages in a market that remained significant. Gold was not merely a relic of the gold standard era, but a continuing store of value that governments and private investors held in enormous quantities. Evelyn's strategic focus on advisory in gold, rather than attempting to build a full-service investment bank, was not universally applauded within the bank or within the family. There were arguments, made with varying degrees of force by different people at different times, that the bank needed to be larger, that it needed to raise outside capital, that it needed to build trading capabilities that would allow it to compete more broadly. Evelyn listened to these arguments and consistently rejected them, maintaining the focus that he believed was the right strategic choice, given the bank's specific competitive position and the family's ownership structure. The decision was, in retrospect, largely correct. The banks that tried to expand aggressively through the Big Bang era often did so at the cost of their independence, being acquired by larger institutions, or requiring capital injections that fundamentally changed their ownership. N M Rothschild maintained its independence and its family ownership throughout this period, trading a larger scale for a preserved identity that the family valued more than size. The Big Bang also created, paradoxically, an opportunity for the kind of institutional reunification across the London and Paris houses that Evelyn had been pursuing. As the financial world globalized, the argument for a single Rothschild entity that could operate across borders became more compelling. A client with operations in both Britain and France, seeking advice on a cross-border transaction, was better served by a single coherent Rothschild institution than by 2 independent houses that cooperated when convenient but were not integrated. The market was creating pressure for the reunification that Evelyn had been trying to achieve through family diplomacy. Any honest account of Evelyn de Rothschild must engage with the man himself, not just the banker and the institutional builder, but the individual whose specific character and style shaped what he built and how he built it. Evelyn was, by the consistent account of people who knew him well, a man of considerable personal presence and considerable personal complexity. He was charming in the specific way that people who have been socially adept since childhood are charming, naturally, without apparent effort, with the ability to make the person he was talking to feel that they had his complete attention. He was also, when he chose to exercise it, capable of a directness that the charming surface could obscure. He could be demanding, impatient with what he perceived as insufficient effort or insufficient intelligence, and decisive in ways that left limited room for the extended consultation that some of his colleagues would have preferred. He was genuinely interested in people, in a range of people that went considerably beyond the City of London financial establishment. His social world was wide and deliberately cultivated. Politicians, journalists, artists, sportspeople, aristocrats, industrialists, and a range of individuals who were interesting to him for reasons that were not immediately reducible to commercial utility. This breadth of social connection was not merely personal preference, it was a professional asset. Because the relationships that produced business opportunities in the advisory world were not confined to the banking community, but extended across the full range of the economic and political establishment. His relationship with the press was more complex than that of most private bankers. He had a well-developed public persona, the Rothschild chairman, with all the legendary associations that the name carried, and he was sufficiently aware of the symbolic importance of that persona to manage it with some deliberateness. He gave interviews, appeared at public events, and was a visible figure in the London social world, in a way that his predecessors at the bank had generally not been. This visibility had strategic dimensions. It kept the Rothschild name in the public consciousness in ways that reinforced the brand's relevance, but it also exposed him to scrutiny that more private figures could avoid. The scrutiny was sometimes uncomfortable. His personal life attracted press attention that he found intrusive. His first marriage to Gina Marie Strauss ended in divorce in 1971, and his subsequent relationships were the subject of press interest that he did not welcome. His eventual second marriage, in 2000, to Lynn Forrester, an American businesswoman who was previously the wife of an Italian politician and who was connected to the highest levels of American Democratic Party politics and international business, generated significant press coverage that reflected both the symbolic significance of the Rothschild name and the genuine public interest in both parties. Lynn Forrester de Rothschild brought to the marriage not just a personal relationship, but a set of connections and perspectives that broadened Evelyn's already wide social and professional network in ways that were mutually reinforcing. Her connections to American political and business circles complemented his European banking relationships, and the couple became a recognized presence at the intersection of international finance, politics, and philanthropy that characterized the globalizing world of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Evelyn's relationship with his own family, with the Rothschild family as an extended institution, rather than simply as his immediate household, was the most significant dimension of his personal life for the purposes of his professional legacy. He took the family seriously as an institution, as a community with shared history and shared obligations, and as the framework within which the banking business existed and derived much of its meaning. This was not simply sentiment. It was a genuine belief that the family's coherence and the business's success were interdependent, that you could not preserve one without attending to the other. This belief expressed itself in a sustained attention to family relationships that went beyond the merely professional. He maintained connections with Rothschild family members across the various branches, the French Rothschild, the various other European branches that had reduced or non-existent banking operations but that remained part of the extended family network, and invested time in the cultivation of those relationships even when the immediate commercial justification was not obvious. He hosted family gatherings. He maintained the Rothschild estates, Ascot House in Buckinghamshire, and the New Court offices in London, as physical expressions of the family's continuity and its commitment to the institutions it had built. He was also, by the accounts of those who worked closely with him, a man who held himself to high standards and who expected those around him to do the same. The N M Rothschild of his tenure was not a particularly forgiving institution for people who did not perform. The combination of the high standards that the Rothschild name implied and the relatively small size of the bank, which meant that every individual's performance was visible, created an environment in which mediocrity was not tolerated. This was not always comfortable, but it produced over time a bank with a consistent quality of judgment and execution that was the foundation of its competitive position. The strategic focus that Evelyn imposed on N M Rothschild during the 1980s and 1990s, the concentration on advisory work and gold trading rather than the attempt to build a full-service investment bank, required more than simply choosing not to do certain things. It required active investment in the capabilities that would make the advisory business genuinely competitive in the era of the Big Bang and the globalization of corporate finance. The advisory business that N M Rothschild built during this period was distinctive in several respects from the advisory practices of the large investment banks. The scale was smaller. The bank was working on fewer transactions simultaneously than a Goldman Sachs or a Morgan Stanley. But the quality of the advisory teams on each transaction was, by the assessment of the clients who used the bank's services, consistently high. The partners who led the advisory work were, in many cases, individuals of exceptional quality who had chosen to work at a bank with a smaller but more prestigious practice, rather than at a larger bank where their specific talents might have been less central. The government advisory practice was a particular strength. N M Rothschild had a long history of advising governments on financial matters. This was, after all, the business that Nathan Mayer Rothschild had been in when he arranged the financing of the Napoleonic Wars. The modern version of this practice involved advising governments on privatizations, on debt management, on the financial aspects of policy decisions, and on the restructuring of state enterprises. As the privatization wave of the 1980s, driven initially by Margaret Thatcher's government in Britain and subsequently adopted across the developed and developing world, transformed the relationship between governments and state enterprises. The demand for high-quality financial advice on these transactions was substantial. N M Rothschild was positioned to serve this demand in ways that its competitors could not easily replicate. The bank's reputation for discretion, for handling sensitive government information with the confidentiality that government clients required, was a genuine competitive advantage. Governments that were undertaking privatizations of politically sensitive industries, managing debt crises that required confidential restructuring, or making financial decisions that could not be exposed to market speculation before they were completed, needed advisors who could be trusted with information that, if leaked, could have significant financial and political consequences. The Rothschild reputation for handling sensitive information with discretion was not merely historical. It was maintained through specific practices and a specific culture that Evelyn reinforced throughout his tenure. The bank did not trade on the basis of client information. It did not share confidential information between client relationships without explicit authorization. It maintained the walls between different client relationships with a consistency that the largest investment banks, with their complex and sometimes conflicted internal structures, could not always match. The privatization advisory practice produced some of the most consequential transactions of the Thatcher era. N M Rothschild advised on the privatization of British Gas, British Telecommunications, British Airways, and a range of other major British state enterprises. These were not merely large transactions in financial terms. They were, individually and collectively, among the most significant economic policy events of the 1980s, transforming the structure of the British economy and serving as models for privatization programs in other countries. The bank's involvement in these transactions generated significant fee income, reinforced its reputation as the advisor of choice for complex government transactions, and built a body of expertise in privatization advisory that was unmatched by any competitor. The international advisory practice expanded as the privatization wave spread beyond Britain. Latin American governments undertaking privatization programs, Eastern European governments restructuring their economies after the end of communism, Asian governments managing financial crises, all generated demand for the specific kind of advisory expertise that N M Rothschild had developed in Britain. The bank's relatively small size was an advantage in international advisory work in some respects. It did not have the internal conflicts of interest that plagued the large investment banks, which were simultaneously advising on transactions and operating proprietary trading desks, whose interests were not always aligned with those of their advisory clients. The gold business remained significant throughout Evelyn's tenure, though the character of the gold market changed substantially during the 1980s and 1990s. The gold price, which had risen dramatically in the inflationary environment of the late 1970s to reach nearly $850 per ounce in January 1980, declined through the following decade as inflation fell and the dollar strengthened. The gold market became less central to the global financial system as the memories of the gold standard era faded and as new financial instruments offered alternative stores of value and hedging mechanisms. N M Rothschild's role in the London gold fix remained structurally important through this period, even as the gold market's relative significance in global finance declined. The twice-daily fix, in which representatives of the 5-member banks met at N M Rothschild's offices to set the benchmark gold price, was one of the most distinctive institutional arrangements in the City of London, a relic of an earlier financial era that continued to function because it served the practical needs of gold market participants who needed a transparent, reliable benchmark for their transactions. In 2004, the McIlhenny Company ended its role in the gold fix, a decision that reflected the changed character of both the gold market and the bank's strategic priorities. The gold fix itself continued, administered by other institutions, but Rothschild's departure marked the end of a chapter in the bank's relationship with the gold market that had extended in various forms for over a century. The decision to exit the gold fix was characteristic of Evelyn's approach to strategic decisions. The willingness to end things that had historical significance when the practical rationale for continuing them had diminished. In order to focus resources on areas where the competitive position was stronger, sentiment and history were factors in his thinking, but they did not override commercial judgment when the judgment was clear. The most enduring legacy of Evelyn de Rothschild's tenure as chairman of N M Rothschild is not any specific transaction, any advisory mandate, or any strategic decision about the bank's competitive positioning. It is the reunification of the fractured Rothschild banking operations into a coherent global institution. The process that began in 1976 with his assumption of the chairmanship and that reached its culmination after Evelyn's retirement in the merger of the London and Paris houses into a single entity. The process of reunification was not a single event. It was a sustained multi-decade effort that required patience, family diplomacy, strategic alignment, and the gradual building of institutional structures that could hold the reunified entity together. Understanding how it happened requires understanding both the obstacles and the mechanisms that Evelyn used to overcome them. The first and most fundamental obstacle was the French nationalization of 1981 and its aftermath. The loss of Rothschild Frères to nationalization had removed the institutional counterpart that any formal reunification would have required. You cannot merge two institutions if one of them has been confiscated. The rebuild of the Paris house as Rothschild and CIA Bank under David de Rothschild in the early 1980s was a prerequisite for any eventual institutional reunification. And the priority during those years had necessarily to be the consolidation of the new French entity rather than its integration with London. The second obstacle was the generational and personal complexity of the Rothschild family itself. The family by the 1980s extended across multiple generations, multiple national branches, and multiple individuals with different relationships to the banking business and different views about its future. The French Rothschilds, who had rebuilt their operation after the nationalization, had strong views about maintaining the independence of the Paris house. Family members in other branches, the various Rothschilds of Switzerland, Israel and elsewhere who were connected to the family but not directly involved in the banking business, had their own perspectives and their own interests. Evelyn's approach to this complexity was characteristically indirect. Rather than attempting to impose a formal structure through the authority of his position as chairman of N M Rothschild, an authority that extended to the London house but did not reach the Paris house or the other branches, he worked through personal relationships, through the building of shared interests, and through the patient demonstration over time that closer coordination between the London and Paris houses was in the interest of both. The key relationship was with David de Rothschild, who had rebuilt the Paris house after the nationalization, and who was by the 1990s one of the most capable and well-regarded bankers in France. David was 20 years younger than Evelyn, had a different personal style and a different set of relationships, and had built the rebuilt Paris house with a character that was distinctly his own, rather than simply a replica of the old Rothschild Frères. The reunification that eventually occurred was possible only because David chose to participate in it, because he concluded, after his own analysis of the strategic situation, that a unified Rothschild institution would be more competitive in the global financial world than two independent houses operating in parallel. The formal steps toward reunification began in the 1990s with the development of shared structures, coordinating committees, shared branding, the development of a unified Rothschild brand identity that both houses would use, that created institutional habits of coordination without yet producing the full merger that was the ultimate objective. These intermediate structures were, in effect, confidence-building measures, demonstrations that coordination was possible and beneficial, that the two houses could work together on client matters without the conflicts of interest or the competitive tensions that had sometimes complicated the relationship between them in the past. The development of a unified Rothschild brand was particularly important. In the 1990s, the Rothschild name appeared in different forms in different markets: N M Rothschild in London, Rothschild and CIA in Paris, with various other forms in other jurisdictions. The inconsistency of the brand presentation across markets was a practical disadvantage in a globalizing business where clients operated across multiple countries and expected consistency from the institutions they worked with. A unified brand identity, a single Rothschild that presented itself consistently across all markets, was both a practical improvement and a symbolic statement about the reunification of the family banking operations. Evelyn retired as chairman of N M Rothschild in 2003. He had been in the role for 27 years, a tenure that was, by the standards of financial institution leadership, remarkable for its length and for the consistency of vision that it represented. His retirement did not end his involvement with the family's affairs. He continued to be active in various capacities, including through the family's philanthropic operations and through his ongoing business relationships. But it formally ended the period of his direct institutional leadership. The final step in the reunification, the formal merger of the London and Paris operations into a single entity, Rothschild & Co., with David de Rothschild as chairman, occurred in 2012, 9 years after Evelyn's retirement. Evelyn did not live to see the full flowering of the unified institution that his work had made possible. He died in November 2002 at the age of 91. But the company that exists today as Rothschild & Co., listed on the Paris Stock Exchange and operating as a single global advisory firm, is the direct institutional descendant of the reunification process that Evelyn drove during his tenure. The reunification was not complete in the sense that all Rothschild family banking interests were brought under a single institutional umbrella. There are Rothschild family members with financial activities outside the unified entity, and the various national branches of the family have their own separate concerns. But the core banking business, the advisory and financial services operations that represent the continuation of the Rothschild banking tradition, is now a single unified institution in a way that it was not when Evelyn took the chairmanship in 1976. This is the achievement that makes Evelyn's tenure historically significant, not the specific deals he advised on, not the strategic decisions he made about the bank's competitive positioning, but the sustained multi-decade effort to reverse the fragmentation of the Rothschild banking enterprise and position it to operate coherently in the financial world of the 21st century. What the summary account of the reunification cannot fully convey is the specific texture of the relationship between Evelyn and David de Rothschild across the years that the process unfolded, the particular combination of mutual respect, family loyalty, strategic alignment, and occasionally genuine tension that characterized two men of strong personality and different generational perspective, working toward a shared objective that neither could achieve alone. David de Rothschild was, in many respects, Evelyn's temperamental opposite. Where Evelyn was shaped by the English financial establishment, by Harrow and Cambridge, by the conservative culture of the City of London in its pre-Big Bang form, by the specific social world of the English upper class that had absorbed the Rothschild family over generations, David was shaped by the specific experience of the French Rothschild family after the nationalization. He had watched his father Guy's institution confiscated by a government that his family had supported, had navigated the legal and financial complexities of the nationalization settlement, and had then rebuilt from essentially nothing with the energy of someone who understood that what had been taken could only be restored through personal effort rather than through institutional inheritance. The rebuilding of the Paris house under David's leadership was one of the more remarkable institutional achievements of the late 20th century French financial world, and it was accomplished in ways that reflected David's specific character rather than simply replicating the character of what had existed before. The old Rothschild frères had been embedded in the specific social and commercial world of French haute bourgeoisie banking, intimate, relationship-driven, connected to the establishment of French industry and government through ties that went back generations. The new Rothschild and CIE that David built was more meritocratic in its hiring, more focused in its competitive positioning, and more attentive to the changing character of European corporate finance than its predecessor had been. This created, in the early years of their collaboration, a genuine difference in institutional culture between the London and Paris houses that went beyond the obvious national differences. London, under Evelyn, was managing the legacy and the reputation of an institution that had been operating continuously since the early 19th century. Paris, under David, was building something new on old foundations, an institution that shared the name and the family connection, but that had been constructed in its current form in the decade after the nationalization. The institutional DNA was different, and the difference mattered when the question of how to bring the two institutions together was being worked through. Evelyn's approach to this difference was characteristically not to minimize it or to insist that the London model was the correct one that Paris should adopt. He understood, because he had spent 30 years managing the complexity of the family's institutional relationships, that David's investment in the rebuilt Paris house was a personal investment as well as a commercial one, and that any reunification that required David to simply subsume what he had built into the London model would not succeed. The reunification had to be genuine, a new entity that incorporated the best of both houses rather than an absorption dressed up as a merger. The practical work of building the shared structures that preceded the formal merger was therefore genuinely collaborative in a way that the word is frequently used, but rarely actually means. The coordinating committees that were established in the 90s were not merely consultative bodies where Evelyn informed David of London's decisions. They were working groups in which the two houses genuinely negotiated about client relationships, about competitive priorities, about the specific areas where joint working would produce better outcomes than separate working, and in which the outcomes genuinely reflected the views of both parties rather than simply the preferences of the larger or more established institution. There were moments of genuine friction in this process, and honesty requires acknowledging them. The two houses were sometimes in competition for the same mandates, the same government seeking privatization advice, the same corporations seeking merger counsel, and the question of how to handle competitive situations between two houses that were simultaneously family institutions and independent competitors was not always easily resolved. The working rules that governed these situations, which house would take the lead, how fees would be shared, how the client relationship would be managed to ensure consistent quality, had to be developed through experience rather than through any pre-existing framework, because no such framework existed. The client-facing dimension of the reunification process was in many ways the most revealing. Clients who had relationships with both houses could see, over the course of the 1990s, whether the coordination between London and Paris was producing better service or merely creating the appearance of coordination while the underlying institutions continued to operate independently. The clients who found that their London and Paris Rothschild advisors were genuinely working together, sharing information, coordinating advice, presenting a consistent view of complex cross-border situations, became advocates for the closer integration of the two houses. The clients who found that the coordination was more nominal than real provided the feedback that drove the continuing refinement of the shared structures. Evelyn was attentive to this feedback in the way that someone who genuinely cares about quality is attentive, not dismissively, not defensively, but with the specific kind of interest that comes from understanding that the client's experience of the institution is the most reliable indicator of whether the institution is actually doing what it claims to be doing. He made it his business to know what major clients thought of the joint working arrangements, and he used that knowledge to push for improvements when the feedback suggested that the arrangements were not working as well as they should. The retirement in 2003 was itself a complex moment in the reunification process. Evelyn's 27 years as chairman of N M Rothschild had given him a personal authority in the family's banking affairs that went beyond the formal authority of his role, an authority derived from the length and consistency of his engagement, from the specific relationships he had maintained across the family and the institution, and from the track record of judgment that a nearly three-decade tenure had produced. When he retired, that personal authority did not automatically transfer to his successor. It had to be rebuilt in a different form by the people who took on the institutional leadership after him. The 9 years between Evelyn's retirement in 2003 and the formal merger in 2012 were therefore years in which the reunification project had to be sustained without the specific personal authority that Evelyn had provided. The fact that it was sustained, that the momentum toward reunification did not dissipate in the absence of his direct leadership, is evidence that the process had by then developed its own institutional logic, its own shared interest, and its own momentum that was independent of any single individual's involvement. This is perhaps the most significant indicator of the genuine depth of what Evelyn had achieved. The reunification process was robust enough to continue and to reach completion without him. The 2012 merger that created the unified Rothschild & Co. was formally structured as a simplification of the corporate architecture that had grown up around the two houses over the preceding decades. The various holding companies, cross-shareholding arrangements, and coordination agreements that had been assembled piece by piece as the reunification proceeded were collapsed into a single structure. The unified entity was listed on the Paris Stock Exchange, with David de Rothschild as chairman, a reflection of the genuine parity between the two houses that the reunification represented, rather than the absorption of one into the other that a less carefully managed process might have produced. The listing on the Paris Stock Exchange, rather than London where N M Rothschild had its historical home, was a deliberate symbolic choice, as well as a practical one. It acknowledged that the rebuilt French house and its founding generation had contributed something essential to the unified institution, and that the reunification was not simply the restoration of a pre-nationalization status quo in which London had been the senior partner. It was a new entity, built on the foundations of both houses, reflecting the contributions of both generations of post-war Rothschild leadership. Evelyn's response to the 2012 merger, to the completion 9 years after his own retirement, of the work he had spent nearly 3 decades advancing, was characteristically understated. He expressed satisfaction that the reunification had occurred, acknowledged David's essential role in making it possible, and noted that the unified institution was better positioned for the future than either house had been independently. He did not claim the credit for the outcome, with the emphasis that he might have been entitled to claim it. He understood, as someone who had spent his career in an institution where the institution mattered more than the individuals who ran it, that the achievement belonged to the process and the family rather than to any single person. What the reunification ultimately demonstrates, and what makes it the appropriate capstone to any account of Evelyn de Rothschild's tenure, is the specific kind of ambition that characterized his career. It was not the ambition of personal aggrandizement. It was not the ambition of institutional dominance, the desire to build the largest or the most profitable financial institution. It was the ambition of institutional coherence, the sustained desire to make the Rothschild banking enterprise function as a unified whole rather than as a collection of independent parts operating in parallel under the same name. This ambition is rarer than it appears. Most institutional leaders, when they inherit a fragmented enterprise, respond either by consolidating aggressively, imposing unity through the exercise of authority rather than through the building of consensus, or by accepting the fragmentation as an unalterable given and working within it rather than trying to change it. Evelyn did neither. He accepted that consolidation by authority was not available to him, that the Paris house was independent and could not be directed from London, and he refused to accept the fragmentation as permanent. He worked instead through the slower, harder, more uncertain path of building the shared interests and the institutional habits that made genuine reunification eventually possible. The path took 36 years from the moment he took the chairmanship to the completion of the merger. 36 years is a long time to sustain a strategic objective in the face of the inevitable setbacks, the periodic arguments against the direction, the moments when the obstacles seemed larger than the progress. The French nationalization, which might have ended the reunification project entirely by destroying the institutional partner that any reunification required, was instead navigated in a way that transformed it from an obstacle into an opportunity. The Big Bang, which might have forced a capital raising that would have fundamentally changed the character of N M Rothschild, was resisted in a way that preserved the specific institutional qualities that made the eventual reunification worthwhile. The generational transition of the 1990s as the founding generation of post-war Rothschild leadership gave way to David's generation was managed in a way that kept the reunification objective alive through the change of leadership on both sides. These were not easy navigations. Each required the specific combination of strategic clarity and tactical flexibility that defines effective long-term institutional leadership, the ability to hold the destination in view while adapting the route to the changing terrain. Evelyn demonstrated this combination consistently across a career long enough to test it against the full range of challenges that European financial history could produce in the late 20th century. The institution that the reunification produced is, in the end, the most honest answer to the question of what Evelyn de Rothschild's 27 years as chairman of N M Rothschild were for. Not the specific transactions, not the advisory mandates, not the strategic decisions about competitive positioning, though all of these mattered, but this, a unified Rothschild & Co. that bears the oldest name in banking, that carries the combined institutional inheritance of the London and Paris houses, and that faces the 21st century as a coherent institution rather than a fragmented collection of independent parts. That is what 36 years of patient, sustained, occasionally frustrating, ultimately successful institutional diplomacy produces. And it is, in the specific context of what the Rothschild family needed from its leadership in the late 20th century, exactly the right achievement. Evelyn de Rothschild died on November 7, 2002, at his home in London. He was 91 years old and had been involved, in one way or another, in the Rothschild banking business for nearly 70 years. The tributes that followed his death reflected the range of roles he had played: the banker, the family patriarch, the philanthropist, the social figure, and the range of people whose lives he had touched across a career of extraordinary length and consequence. The most immediate question that his death raised, the question of what he had built and what would remain, had, in important respects, already been answered. The Rothschild & Co., that he had spent 30 years working to make possible, was a functioning institution, a publicly listed company with a global advisory practice, offices across multiple continents, and a business model that was genuinely competitive in the segment of the financial market where it had chosen to operate. It was not the largest advisory firm in the world. The American giants of investment banking dwarfed it in revenue and in headcount, but it was one of the most prestigious, one of the most consistently well regarded by the clients and the counterparties who worked with it. The Rothschild name, which Evelyn had spent his entire career tending with the care that a vintner tends a great wine estate, was as strong at his death as it had been at any point in his tenure. Perhaps stronger because the reunification of the family banking operations under a single brand had concentrated rather than diluted the prestige that the name carried. The conspiracy theories and the mythology that attend the name remained and would remain. The Rothschild family has long since accepted that a portion of the public attention directed at their name is composed of projections and fantasies rather than engagement with the actual institution. But the reality of what the name represented, a 200-year tradition of financial advisory work, a specific expertise in the most complex and sensitive transactions, a reputation for discretion and judgment that was the foundation of the client relationships, was intact. The financial world that Evelyn had navigated across his 27-year tenure had changed almost beyond recognition from what it had been when he took the chairmanship in 1976. The Big Bang had restructured the City of London. The end of the Cold War had created new markets and new opportunities across Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. The internet and digital technology had transformed the information environment within which financial institutions operated. The financial crisis of 2008 had restructured the global banking system in ways whose full consequences were still being worked through. Through all of these transformations, N M Rothschild, and subsequently the unified Rothschild & Co., had maintained its identity and its independence. This was not a given. Many of the great names of European private banking had, during Evelyn's tenure, either ceased to exist independently or had been absorbed into larger institutions that had replaced their original character with something different. Kleinwort Benson, Ambrose Samuel Montague, Warburgs, names that had been as significant as Rothschild in the City of London of the 1970s, were gone as independent entities by the end of the century. The Rothschild institution survived as itself. The survival was not automatic or inevitable. It was the product of specific decisions about strategy, about capital, about the relationship between the London and Paris houses, about what the bank would do and what it would not do, that Evelyn made and maintained across 3 decades. Some of these decisions were genuinely difficult, made against significant internal or external pressure. The refusal to raise outside capital and expand aggressively during the Big Bang era, when every competitor was doing exactly that, required a confidence in the alternative strategy that not everyone in the bank shared. The sustained effort to maintain and improve the relationship with the Paris house, when the nationalization of 1981 and the subsequent rebuild might have been taken as justification for a more distant relationship, required a vision of the eventual outcome that was not always shared by those around him. Evelyn de Rothschild was not a perfect banker. He was not the most analytically gifted or the most technically innovative financial mind of his generation. There were transactions he mishandled and strategic decisions that, in retrospect, were not optimal. He had a reputation for impatience and for a certain imperious quality that could make him difficult to work for and that occasionally produced interpersonal difficulties that a more diplomatically gifted leader might have avoided. But he was, in the specific circumstances that history presented to him, exactly the kind of leader that the Rothschild banking enterprise needed. He had the patience to work across complex family relationships over decades rather than demanding immediate resolution. He had the strategic clarity to maintain a consistent vision of what the bank should be even as the environment around it changed dramatically. He He had the personal authority. The combination of the Rothschild name, the length of his tenure, and the specific relationships he had cultivated to make and sustain decisions that other leaders might not have been able to implement. He also had something that is undervalued in accounts of business leadership: the wisdom to know what he was and what he was not. Evelyn did not attempt to transform N M Rothschild into something fundamentally different from what it was, did not try to make it a full-service investment bank, did not attempt to compete across all the areas where the large American and European banks were expanding. He maintained and strengthened the specific things that made the Rothschild name meaningful, and allowed the things that were not consistent with that meaning to develop in their own direction. The Rothschild family itself, as a multi-generational institution, was also in better shape at his death than it had been when he took the chairmanship. The reunification of the banking operations was one dimension of this. The family's primary institutional expression was coherent in a way it had not been for decades. But the broader family, the extended network of Rothschild family members across Europe and beyond, who maintained the shared identity and the shared history, was also better organized and more consciously tended than it had been in the fractured post-war decades. The philanthropy that Evelyn supported, through the Rothschild Foundation and through various personal commitments, reflected the same values that had characterized the Rothschild family's philanthropic tradition since its earliest days: a genuine sense of obligation to the communities in which the family operated, and a specific commitment to the Jewish community, whose history the Rothschild family had shared across centuries of both prosperity and persecution. The charitable commitments were not merely performative. They reflected a genuine belief that the extraordinary fortune and the extraordinary name carried obligations that extended beyond the family itself. In the end, what Evelyn de Rothschild built was not simply a banking institution or a family legacy. He built continuity, the bridge between what the Rothschild banking enterprise had been in the 19th century and what it would become in the 21st. He took a fractured, diminished, post-war version of one of history's greatest financial dynasties and gave it the coherence, the strategic focus, and the institutional architecture to continue in the changed world of modern finance. That is not a small thing. Institutions do not preserve themselves. They require, at each generation, individuals who understand what is worth preserving and are willing to do the sustained, often unglamorous work of preservation. Evelyn de Rothschild was that individual for the Rothschild banking dynasty, the person who, in the specific circumstances of his time, made the difference between an institution that continued and one that did not. The Rothschild name will continue. The institution that carries it will face challenges that its current leaders cannot fully anticipate, as every institution does, but it will face those challenges with the coherence, the reputation, and the specific capabilities that Evelyn de Rothschild spent his career building and protecting. That is his legacy. And it is, by any measure, a substantial one. From a boardroom in 1976 where English and French cousins finally agreed, to a unified global institution bearing the oldest name in banking. That is the arc of Evelyn de Rothschild's extraordinary career. A man who did not invent anything, did not disrupt anything, did not build from nothing. A man who simply held together what others had built across 3 decades of change and challenge and handed it on, intact, coherent, and ready for the century ahead. That is a rarer achievement than it sounds, and it is worth remembering. What the standard accounts of Evelyn de Rothschild's tenure tend to underemphasize is the specific texture of what holding an institution together across 3 decades actually feels like from the inside. The accumulation of daily decisions, small and large, that collectively constitute the preservation of something that could easily have been lost. The dramatic moments, the French nationalization, the Big Bang, the formal reunification, are the visible events. But the institution was actually preserved or lost in the quieter moments in between, in the choices that were made when no particular crisis demanded a decision and when the easier path was always available. Consider the question of capital. Throughout Evelyn's tenure, there was a recurring argument within N M Rothschild about whether the bank needed to raise outside capital, to bring in institutional investors, to issue shares, to access the funding that would allow it to compete on scale with the large investment banks that were transforming the global financial landscape. The argument had genuine logic behind it. The Big Bang had made scale more important. The privatization mandates that were one of the bank's strongest competitive areas were growing in size. The cross-border transactions that the globalizing economy required were becoming too large for a purely relationship-based private bank to handle without access to capital markets. Evelyn heard this argument from partners, from advisors, from people whose commercial judgment he respected. He heard it not once but many times, across many years, from people who were making the case in good faith and with genuine analytical support. And he consistently, patiently, with explanations rather than simply with the authority of his position, declined to act on it. His argument was not that the analysis was wrong. He acknowledged the commercial logic of the capital case. His argument was that the specific things that made N M Rothschild valuable were precisely the things that outside capital would erode: the alignment of management and ownership, the long time horizon of decision-making, the confidentiality of financial affairs that private ownership enabled, and the specific culture that a private partnership produced in the people who worked within it. The culture argument was the one he returned to most often, because it was the one he believed most deeply. A bank staffed by people who knew they were working for the partners, who knew that the reputation they were building was also the partners' personal reputation, and that a mistake they made would be felt directly by the people whose name was on the door, produced a different quality of work than a bank staffed by people who were employees of a public company with dispersed shareholders and professional managers. The alignment was different. The care was different. The specific kind of pride in the institution that private partnership produces was different, and it showed in the quality of the advice that clients received. This was not a naive argument. It was an argument that Evelyn could support with evidence, with the specific comparative record of N M Rothschild's advisory work against the work of the large integrated banks that had raised capital and expanded aggressively. The large banks were doing more transactions, but they were also more often caught in conflicts of interest, making decisions that served their proprietary trading books rather than their advisory clients, and producing advice that was shaped by the institutional pressures of a public company rather than by the specific interests of the client in front of them. Rothschild's smaller, more focused operation did not have these conflicts, and the clients who understood this were willing to pay a premium for advice they could genuinely trust. The people whom Evelyn hired, and the people he chose not to hire, which is often the more revealing decision, reflected this philosophy consistently. He was not looking for the most aggressive rainmakers, the people who would generate the largest fee income regardless of the quality of the work. He was looking for people who had the judgment to give clients advice that served the client's interests even when that advice was difficult to hear, and who had the personal integrity to maintain client confidentiality with a seriousness that the largest banks, with their complex internal structures and their numerous potential conflicts, could not always match. The result was a bank that was, in the experience of the clients who used it, genuinely different from its competitors, not in every dimension, not in ways that made it the right choice for every transaction, but in the specific dimensions that mattered most, for the transactions where judgment and trust were the primary requirements. The major privatizations that N M Rothschild advised on during the 1980s and 1990s were won not primarily because the bank offered the lowest fees or the most sophisticated financial models. The large investment banks could match or exceed those criteria, but because the governments commissioning the work believed that Rothschild advisors would give them honest assessments of complex situations rather than assessments shaped by the bank's own investment interests. There is a moment that several people who worked at N M Rothschild during Evelyn's tenure have described in various forms. The moment when they understood what was different about the institution they had joined. It typically involved being in a client meeting where the commercially obvious recommendation, the one that would generate more fees, lead to more subsequent transactions, position the bank well for future business, was not the right recommendation for the client's actual situation, and discovering that the expectation at Rothschild was to give the right recommendation regardless of its commercial implications for the bank. This sounds like a simple ethical principle. In the competitive environment of late 20th century investment banking, where fee generation was the primary metric by which bankers were evaluated, it was actually a fairly radical institutional commitment. Evelyn himself embodied this commitment not just as a policy but as a personal practice. The stories that his colleagues and clients have told about him, the moments that stuck in people's memories because they were unexpected, tend to involve him saying something that he did not need to say, something that cost him commercially or socially, because it was true, and because the person he was talking to needed to hear it. He had, in the specific sense that the word is used in advisory relationships, genuine candor. Not the performed candor of someone who understands that a reputation for straight talking is itself commercially valuable, but the genuine variety, the willingness to tell clients things they did not want to hear, because the alternative was to have been less than honest with them. This quality, so straightforward to describe, so difficult to sustain in an environment that rewards a different set of behaviors, was transmitted imperfectly but recognizably through the institution he led. It was part of what the Rothschild brand meant in practice as opposed to in legend, and it required continuously active reinforcement from the top of the institution, because the pressures that erode it, the competitive pressure to win business, the social pressure to tell clients what they want to hear, the institutional pressure to generate fee income, are constant and powerful. Beyond the banking institution itself, Evelyn de Rothschild's legacy includes something less often discussed: his role in maintaining the Rothschild family's relationship with its own history. The family's history is not an easy thing to carry. It includes extraordinary achievements and extraordinary suffering. The construction of one of the most remarkable financial institutions in the history of capitalism, and the experience of persecution that has followed the Jewish people across centuries. Evelyn was born into a generation that was the direct inheritor of the Holocaust's impact on the Rothschild family. The destruction of the Vienna branch, the deaths of family members, the flight of others, the confiscation of assets that had been built over generations. He was old enough to understand the full weight of what had happened, and young enough to have spent his career in a world that was, at least in Western Europe, processing the aftermath of that catastrophe. His relationship with Jewish communal life and with the history of Jewish experience in Europe was not performative or merely institutional. It was, by the accounts of those who knew him well, genuinely personal, a felt connection to a history that was his history, in the most direct and specific sense. The philanthropic commitments that he maintained throughout his career to Jewish educational institutions, to Holocaust remembrance, to the preservation of Jewish cultural heritage, were expressions of this personal connection, rather than simply exercises in brand management. He gave not because giving was expected of Rothschild, but because the causes he supported were causes he believed in. The anti-Semitism that has attached itself to the Rothschild name for 2 centuries, the conspiracy theories, the fantasies of secret control, the sinister mythologies that have circulated in pamphlets and now on the internet, was something Evelyn encountered throughout his career and had to navigate with a combination of dignity and pragmatism. He could not eliminate it. He could not argue the conspiracy theorists out of their beliefs. What he could do was ensure that the actual institution, the real Rothschild Bank, with its real clients and its real practices and its real record, was sufficiently well documented and sufficiently present in the public consciousness to provide a counterweight to the mythology. The visibility he maintained throughout his career, the interviews, the public appearances, the presence in the financial press, was partly an expression of his natural sociability, but it was also a deliberate strategy of institutional transparency that served a genuine purpose. The question of what comes after Evelyn is the question that the family and the institution are now working through, as they always have. The Rothschild & Co. that he helped make possible is in 2024 a genuinely global institution, with advisory operations across Europe, the Americas, Asia and other markets, with a financial restructuring practice that is one of the most respected in the world, and with the asset management operations that have been added to the traditional advisory business. The institution is larger and more diverse than what Evelyn managed at N M Rothschild, and it faces challenges that are different from the ones he navigated. The challenge of maintaining culture and quality across a much larger and more geographically dispersed organization. The challenge of competing in an advisory market that has been reshaped by the rise of the large American investment banks and the emergence of boutique advisory firms. The challenge of remaining relevant to clients whose financial needs are increasingly complex and whose options for sophisticated advice are increasingly numerous. These are not challenges that Evelyn solved. They are the challenges that his successors, David de Rothschild and the generation after him, have inherited. But they inherited them in a better position than they would have been in if Evelyn had not done what he did. They inherited a unified institution rather than two separate ones. They inherited a brand that had been maintained at a consistent standard rather than diluted by inconsistent quality or strategic drift. They inherited a culture, imperfectly transmitted, inevitably evolved, but recognizably descended from the culture that Evelyn reinforced throughout his tenure, that continued to produce the kind of work that justified the premium the Rothschild name commanded. There is a specific kind of leader who is only fully appreciated after they are gone, whose contribution is visible not in the dramatic events of their tenure, but in the condition of the institution at the moment of their departure. Evelyn de Rothschild was this kind of leader. The institution he handed on was not transformed. It was not dramatically larger, or more profitable, or more innovative than what he had inherited, but it was coherent, focused, well-positioned, and genuinely itself. Recognizably, the continuation of what the Rothschild banking enterprise had been at its best, adapted to the conditions of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, rather than simply preserved as a relic of an earlier era. He did not build a monument. He did not make a fortune that dwarfed what his predecessors had made. He did not arrange a transaction that reshaped the global financial system the way that Nathan Mayer Rothschild had reshaped it in the Napoleonic era. He did something more difficult and more necessary in the specific moment he occupied. He held the line. He maintained the institution in conditions that were challenging enough to have destroyed it, and he positioned it for continuation in conditions that he could see coming, but could not fully control. The line that he held was not a line in the sand, not a dramatic defensive position maintained against overwhelming force. It was a line of principle, maintained quietly, consistently, in the daily decisions of a long career, against the steady pressure of a financial world that rewarded different behaviors than the ones he was committed to. The pressure to raise outside capital and grow. The pressure to raise outside capital and grow. The pressure to compete across all areas rather than focusing on the areas where the competitive position was genuinely strong. The pressure to let the family relationships fracture further rather than investing the time and the patience required to maintain and eventually strengthen them. He resisted these pressures not through heroic effort, but through the sustained application of a clear-eyed judgment about what mattered and what didn't, what was worth preserving and what could be allowed to change, what the Rothschild name meant in practice, and what it would need to mean if it was going to continue to mean anything at all. This judgment was not infallible. He made mistakes, some of them significant, but it was consistent and it was honest. And consistency and honesty applied across a career of sufficient length produce results that are not achievable any other way. The great families of European finance, the Rothschilds, the Barings, the Morgans, the Warburgs, built their institutions across generations, and the institutions that survived were the ones that produced in each generation individuals capable of understanding what their moment required and of providing it. Some generations required builders, individuals who could identify opportunities and construct institutions from nothing. Some generations required innovators, individuals who could reinvent what existed in response to changing circumstances. Evelyn's generation required something different. It required a holder, someone who could keep the institution together in conditions of fragmentation and change, who could bridge the gap between what the institution had been and what it would need to become, and who could hand it on with the coherence and the credibility that the next stage of its development required. Evelyn de Rothschild was the holder that his generation required. He understood this about himself, in the way that genuinely self-aware people understand the specific role they are suited to play. He did not pretend to be Nathan Mayer Rothschild. He did not pretend to be the most brilliant or the most innovative banker of his era. He understood that the work of his era was the work of holding together, and he did that work with a sustained commitment that lasted for 27 years of chairmanship and the decades of involvement that preceded and followed it. When the tributes came, from colleagues, from clients, from family members, from the financial press and the broader public who had known him as a social figure and as the representative of the most famous name in banking, they were tributes to a man who had done his specific job extraordinarily well. Not the job of the visionary or the revolutionary, but the job of the steward. And stewardship, done well and done long, is one of the most valuable things that a person can offer to the institution they are entrusted with. The new court offices in the City of London, where N M Rothschild has operated since 1809, and where Evelyn sat at the head of the table for 27 years, will continue to operate under the unified Rothschild & Co. banner. The name above the door is older than most of the countries whose governments the institution has advised. The work that goes on inside continues the tradition, adapted, modernized, operating with technology and in markets that would be unrecognizable to the founders, but continuous in its essential character. Evelyn de Rothschild did not build New Court. He inherited it, tended it, and passed it on. That is the oldest and most essential form of stewardship. And it is what the 200-year Rothschild banking tradition at its best has always been. Not the construction of monuments, but the maintenance of something worth maintaining across the specific challenges of each generation in service of the generations that follow. That is what he did. That is what it meant. And the institution that carries his family's name into the 21st century is the evidence of how completely he succeeded. So we have traced the full arc, from the boardroom meeting of 1976, where Evelyn de Rothschild first confronted the full complexity of what he had inherited, through the French nationalization of 1986, through the sustained decades of family diplomacy and institutional building, to the unified Rothschild & Co., whose existence today is the most tangible evidence of what Evelyn's tenure achieved. The Rothschild story is one of the great continuity stories of Western capitalism, a family business that has survived in various forms for over 2 centuries, through circumstances that destroyed most of its contemporaries and many of its successors. The survival is not accidental. It is the product of specific decisions made by specific individuals in specific circumstances. And the decisions that Evelyn de Rothschild made during his 27 years as chairman of N M Rothschild were among the most important of those decisions. The modern relevance of the Rothschild story is not primarily about banking. Most people will never interact with a Rothschild institution in any capacity. It is about what institutional continuity requires and what it costs. It requires individuals who are willing to subordinate their personal ambitions to the longer-term interests of the institution, who choose preservation over expansion, coherence over scale, reputation over growth. It costs the specific opportunities for personal aggrandizement and institutional aggression that the alternative strategy would have provided. Evelyn de Rothschild made that choice consistently across 3 decades. The institution he tended is the evidence of what that choice produces. The Rothschilds have survived the Napoleonic Wars, 2 World Wars, the Holocaust, the nationalization of their French bank, the Big Bang, and the financial crisis of 2008. They have survived not because they were immune to these events, but because each generation produced individuals capable of navigating the specific challenges that their moment presented. Evelyn de Rothschild was that individual for his moment, the man who held the dynasty together when it was most at risk of falling apart, and who built the institutional architecture that gave the next generation the tools to continue. The name endures. The institution continues. The family remains. And in the wood-paneled offices of Rothschild & Co., the work that Mayor Amschel Rothschild began in the Judengasse of Frankfurt 2 centuries ago goes on, adapted, evolved, restructured beyond recognition in its specifics, but continuous in its essential character. That is what Evelyn de Rothschild saved, and that is why his story deserves to be told.